So, whereas in the first game we examined a good knight versus a bad bishop situation, for this game and the next, we're going to take a look at good bishop versus not so good knight. So, to demonstrate some of the themes, I've selected two games, both featuring Bobby Fischer. The first one is this one, Boris Spassky against Bobby Fischer, played in 1966. And actually, Fischer is on the losing end of the equation, and then the second game will show Bobby Fischer actually winning the game. But for now, let's zone in on this game, and we're on move 28, and black has just played the move king to g7, and the position is approximately equal, but we might say that the black king is a little bit less safe in this situation. We notice the bishop cutting across, the knight as well has some potential sacrificial jumps since the pawn is on g6. We notice that white is well coordinated on the d file and also has the option of accessing the f file since the knight is covering that square. So definitely Spassky with the better chances, and he makes full use of it. So he goes rook to f1, queen e7, queen d4 check, rook to f6, and here the move knight to e4. And it forces the exchange of this knight for this bishop, since otherwise black is losing material. And after this, well, Boris Spassky was counting on the centralized bishop on the longest diagonal and also one of the second longer diagonals. So this very centralized bishop against the knight on the rim. We have this expression, some of you will know it, that a knight on the rim is dim. And of course, there are many situations where that general rule fails to hold true. But in this particular case, it is indeed a not very effective piece, since its only squares that it can move to are highlighted, and we notice that the white bishop is already doing a good job, as well as this pawn here on a2, doing a good job of restricting that knight on a5. The one good thing about the knight is that at least it's well supported, so it's not going to be captured, it's not going to be lost anytime soon, but most of the action is taking place on this area of the board here. And we can see that the bishop is playing an important role while this knight is not, so this is a concern. Black actually played the move queen to c5, which is very logical, and forcing the exchange of queens, since his king was a little bit less safe. Queen takes c5, and now rook takes f1 check, intermezzo move, getting all of the heavy pieces off the board. King takes f1 and b takes c5. But this is a somewhat uncomfortable position, because one of the things that we can also perhaps take note of is this pawn majority here on the king side is a little bit problematic for black. He needs to constantly watch out for the possibility of a pawn, this 2-to-1 turning into just an outside passer on the h file. And notice that this bishop on e4 may be able to support a pawn as far as h7, and that would be very inconvenient. And well, in the meantime, the white king may be able to somehow at some point, of course right now it's not possible, but at some point move around on the queen side and go after the black pawns in the event that white has tied the black king down to the king side because of this majority. So definitely the structure once again playing a role in the fight, but the main point is that for now this knight on a5 is extremely limited. These are not available squares, nor is b3, and so it's limited to this c4 jump. White played the move pawn to h4. Under ideal circumstances, white would like to drop the bishop to d5 and completely eliminate the knight from the game. But unfortunately, black does have the option of king f6 to e5, and this bishop is not stable here. If white had a pawn on e4, we could already be speaking of a forced win, because this knight simply cannot get back into the game. Pawn to h4, knight to c4, king to e2. Notice black tries to bring the knight back into the game. King e2, knight e5. And here knight e5 is a little bit of a mistake, actually. Instead, black's best bet was to play king to h6, and after bishop to d5, now go knight to e5. And we notice that the knight on e5 is controlling white and preventing white from being able to play moves such as g5. And at the same time, I was also indicating king h5 as a possibility, targeting that h-pawn. And also there are g5 ideas whereupon white must recapture rather than be able to push h5, which would typically be more favorable if he could conserve a passed h-pawn rather than a passed g-pawn, because if you keep a passed g-pawn, the black king can control it while being a little bit closer to, the rest of the action on the board. That goes back again to this principle of an outside passer. So this was definitely the way that Bobby Fischer should have continued, and well, perhaps black can hold. Let's see what actually happened. Knight went to e5, king went to e3, king to f6, and now king to f4. And now we see that the respective king situation, it's actually a little reminiscent of our first game where Capablanca had the white pieces, and we saw these plans involving a king march via h5 quite soon and trying to mobilize the kingside pawns for black. Here now, instead, well, the white king is doing very well relative to the black king. It's more active. Black played the move knight to f7, and mysteriously, Spassky plays the move king back to e3. I don't really understand why he would do this, other than perhaps figuring that after king e3, black would just go knight to e5, and maybe he just wanted to play king f4 here. And I note that the move king e3 was played on move 39, so for those of you who do not know, back then, move 40 was a very significant moment in the game, a very significant move number, because at that point, you would have time added onto your clock, typically a very significant chunk of time, like 1 hour to each clock. So there may have been some time trouble issue going on, I am not sure. Nevertheless, so in this position, rather than play king to e3, the move bishop to d5 would have been more logical and very, very strong, hitting the knight. And also keep in mind one factor, which is, let's imagine that black just plays a silly pawn move. Then, in fact, it's very important to know your pawn endings, because here bishop takes f7, king takes f7. And several moves win, but let's say king to e4. And the point is that, once again, this effective majority here represents an outside pass pawn, because 2 minus 1 is 1. So it's like a net 1 pawn here, either on the g or in the h file, probably g4, h5. So pawn takes, and after pawn takes, we would probably be left with an h pawn. And we have an h pawn, and then we have this situation over here where the black king is going to be preoccupied dealing with the pawn, and the white king in the meantime is just going to scoop up both of the queenside pawns, and this a pawn will decide the game. Black will not have time to scoop up the white passed pawn and also return in time to prevent this pawn from promoting. Yeah, so after bishop to d5, there's an immediate threat. Black would have to move the knight, and then white could continue with a move such as g4 perhaps. Black could also play the move g5 check, but the situation is nevertheless very, very bad. Instead, king e3 was played, and black played the move pawn to g5. And here white had the opportunity to play h5 and creating this outside pass pawn that we've already been speaking of. Black now played the move knight to h6, which compounds his problems, because here, once again, it's a little bit like before. We were saying a knight on the rim is dim when the knight was on a5 and very limited for options. And here, while that knight has gone into c4 and then onto e5, then f7, and now to h6. So it's sort of, going from one side of the board to the other rather than staying in the center. But of course, that was necessary because here it was doing nothing, and here it needs to do something about this passed h pawn. The king goes to d3 for white, the black king goes to e6, and now white plays a waiting move, bishop to a8. This is one of the advantages of the bishop over the knight, which is that a knight cannot burn a tempo in the same way that a bishop can. For example, if you had a particular position, which is a position of Zugzwang, in other words, were it your opponent's move, the position on the board would be winning for you, but it's your move, so you want to burn a tempo. If you have a bishop, typically you can burn a tempo very easily. For instance, you can just move the bishop from here to here, and then back to here, and you can sort of get the same position, but with your opponent to move instead, quite effortlessly. But you cannot do this with a knight, because a knight is more limited in its choice, and as a consequence, we cannot, for example, if your knight is on h6, you can move the knight, and then on move 2, you can get the knight back to h6. Or you could go 1, 2, 3, and then on move 4, back to h6. Or you could go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then on move 6, you're back to h6. But what you notice is that in every case, the move is back at an even number for the knight, which makes sense because if the knight moves wherever it goes on the first move, then on the second move it can return. And then if it goes away further, then it can return on the 4th or on the 6th or on the 8th, and so on. And this does not apply for the bishop, because if the bishop is on a8, and you want this position, you want to get this position with the opponent to move, or with you to move, instead of the opponent to move. You just want to reverse who it is to move. So what you could do is you could play a move such as, let's say, bishop to c6 on move 1, and then on move 2 you don't have to return to a8. But instead you could go bishop c6 on move 1, bishop b7 on move 2, and bishop a8 on that odd number on move 3. And so you are able to burn a tempo. This is a concept that should perhaps be illustrated in its own video to really be properly understood by those of you who haven't come across this concept before. But I just wanted to bring it up here quickly because I think it's important to note that here white, was able to play such a move as bishop to a8, and he will, as we will see later on, be able to sort of leverage this benefit that the bishop has over the knight, which is the flexibility of choosing where it wants to go and if it wants to burn a tempo or not. So black goes king to d6 and now king to c4. So notice, for instance, this position is already an example where if it were white to move, he may wish to somehow burn a tempo with the bishop and obtain this position with black to move, because if you notice, the king is stuck to the defense of the pawn on c5, and neither of these squares are available. So under different circumstances with a different piece distribution or piece and pawn distribution outside of this situation here, white may actually be able to win just by virtue of leaving his opponent in a position of zugzwang. So black plays the move g4 instead, and now white goes a4. And one of the properties of minor pieces, which needs to be kept in mind, is that by themselves they cannot snap off a passed pawn, like white's h-pawn here. Black does not have the opportunity of going knight g8 to f6 and hoovering up this pawn, because if you go knight g8 and then you go knight f6, the second you go knight f6, I'm going to play h6. And were you to go back to g8 to target my pawn, then I would play h7, right? So there's no way, unlike if it was a rook or a queen, unlike the heavy pieces, there's no way for a knight by itself, any minor piece by itself, to actually take the pawn. It can only block the pawn's advance. So therefore, black is paralyzed because the knight is in charge of this pawn over here on h5, and the king is in charge of the pawn on c5. And so therefore, with the dominant minor piece and the dominant pawn structure to boot, white is able to convert this quite easily. Knight goes to g8, a5, knight to h6, bishop to e4, g3, king to b5, knight to g8. Notice black is really just zigzagging back and forth with the knight. Bishop to b1. The real long-range nature of the bishop is on show here. It's going from a8 to e4 to b1, just transferring, cutting through the board very, very easily. The black knight goes back to h6, and now king a6 is the point. So the bishop here from b1 is potentially going to support that pawn all the way if the knight ever gets distracted. It's also potentially going to post itself on g6 from where it will support the pawn, and the pawn will support the bishop, and on top of that it will cover that c2 square, which is very important for the control of that c-pawn. And once again we return to this point that we mentioned in game 1, which is that typically in situations where sides have pawns on each side of the board, like here on the queen and the king side, the bishop is a dominant piece over the knight, all else being equal. King steps on to c6, and now bishop to a2. And here black in fact resigned because, well, black, no matter what he does, is going to lose the a pawn, and after that it should be a quite trivial win. I'll show you how play might have continued. So black would go king c7, king takes a7, knight to f5. The king must stay, preventing the white king from escaping. Because if the black king, let's say, steps up, then white would probably go bishop c4, covering that b5 square, and then sooner or later king to b6, and then just escort the pawn up the board, and black is powerless to stop this. After knight f5, white could go bishop to c4, knight to h6, and now a beautiful move, and very, very instructive, and once again returning to this point we examined in the first game, the Capablanca-Reshevsky game, bishop to e6. Notice this relationship. It's a very, very important relationship between the bishop and the knight. We see two squares in between. A long rank and file was the comment made in the Capablanca-Reshevsky game. So what's the important significance of this relationship? We want the bishop, if we want to dominate the knight with the bishop, we want to leave two squares, either a long rank or a long file, between the bishop and the knight. And by doing so, we notice that the bishop will take away all of the jumps, the forward-facing jumps of the knight. And so here, because the knight is already on the edge of the board and quite limited, it only has 4 potential jumps, the bishop actually here just completely paralyzes the knight. We can also perhaps note a couple of other details about why this e6 square is so great for the bishop. The most obvious point is that it also prevents the black pawn from advancing at all. And then an additional detail is that it also covers the c8 square, which more than likely won't be an especially relevant square, but it does take away the option for black of retreating to c8, maybe if you wanted to somehow sort of fend off, try to control the escape of the king by the use of the c8 square. So this control of these squares, c4, c8, f7, g8, f5, and g4, is really, really fantastic. You cannot ask for much more out of this minor piece, whereas the knight is, of course, almost entirely useless right now. Well, actually, black can only really just resign in this position because, let's say if he chooses to move king to d6, which would seek to chase the bishop away, then in this position here, white can actually play the move king to b6. This is the most convincing continuation. And if you capture the bishop, then a6, c4, a7, c3, and a8 queen. c2, black is just one tempo away, and after queen a2 check, the pawn is falling. And needless to say that if black doesn't attempt the pawn race, well, he's not in time to prevent this pawn from promoting. Perhaps just for, well, to be comprehensive, we might ask ourselves, well, what happens in the event of king to c6? And the idea is that if king to b8, then black can at least play this move king to b5. That's a good question. But the answer is relatively simple. White will just go king to a6. And the situation is that if in the event of king to d6, then king b6 will just take us back to this original line we just showed. And in the event of king to c7, then king to b5 will once again strike at this pawn on c5. And, well, if black goes king to d6, we know that this pawn cannot be stopped. And if black sits back and does nothing, let's say plays king to b7 in order to keep tabs on this a pawn, then if nothing else, white can just collect this pawn, march his king on over, pick up the next pawn, and win in this fashion. So therefore, after the move bishop to e6, wherever the king goes, whether it's c6 or whether it's d6, then the white king will respond either via b6 in the event of d6 or via a6 in the event of c6, and after that it's game over. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this second game. It's quite impressive, actually, a testament to Boris Spassky's tremendous strength as a chess player, because Bobby Fischer not only was one of the very greatest players that ever lived, but in fact he was quite famous for his handling of the bishop in bishop versus knight situations. So he had a lot of experience in such kind of minor piece play positions, and Well, that kind of experience can be helpful when defending the knight versus bishop situation. In other words, when you have the knight, but here he was unable to defend it against Boris Spassky and he lost.